We talk a lot about making lifestyle changes and improving your diet, your exercise, and your eating habits, and educating you about how you can accomplish these lifestyle changes because you know what? They're not that easy. Now, I could talk all day long about research and teach you about what small scale studies and large scale studies show about the power of migrating towards a plant-based diet. But guess what? I don't want to talk about research today. That's not the point. Today, I'd rather talk about what's happening inside of your head and what's happening inside of my head and what's happening inside of the heads of many people when they are presented with the idea of changing their lifestyle. Now, we can talk about the details and we can talk about the success, and you can see the expected timeline of change. These are all important things because there's a conversation that happens under the surface that oftentimes can get in the way of actually starting a lifestyle change program and staying consistent. It's these little things that get in the way that oftentimes you're not even aware of because sometimes they're happening in your subconscious brain. Some of the conversations may be conscious. Some of the conversations may be things you say verbally to other people. But the truth is that most of these things happen in a subconscious manner, and you may not even be aware that they're happening. And those can be pretty nasty, and they can get wrapped up in a whole bunch of emotions, and they can actually be at the very root of why it's so challenging to start making lifestyle change happen. Now, you may have heard of Brené Brown. She's a woman who has revolutionized the world of emotional psychology, both in the workplace and at home. She's been a pioneer in starting hard conversations that most people just flat out don't want to have. And she's also been a pioneer in identifying the things that are flat out hard to talk about. She does an incredible job of digging deep into the uncomfortable and frustrating and silent obstacles that get in the way. So that's why in this video, we're going to unwrap 7 things that get in the way of lifestyle change. We're not going to talk about it this time from a health perspective, though we could talk about that until we're blue in the face. Instead, we're going to talk about this from a habit change perspective and try and get deep inside of your head and deep inside of your brain so that we can understand why these conversations are happening in the first place and what you can do about them. Now, oftentimes getting started with lifestyle change is actually the hardest part for most people because there's this sort of activation energy which is required to begin the process of changing your habits. Now, it's easy to visualize change as though you're trying to climb this very large mountain and you're at the base of it and you don't even really want to get to the top. And the hardest part can actually sometimes be making your first ascent up the base of the mountain so that you can just get started with the process. But rather than taking a look at this large mountain in front of you and telling yourself that it's really impossible to get over to the other side or maybe even to get close to the top, I want you to think about it from another perspective. I want you to visualize it in a more realistic and actually more representative way of lifestyle change is actually like. Okay. Rather than taking a look at a large mountain and then getting discouraged about it, I want you to visualize a small hill, like a really small hill. Okay. Something as small as a highway overpass. That's not even really a hill in the first place. It's just a tiny little bridge, if you will, to get over a road. Okay. Now, if you visualize a highway overpass in your head, think about being on one side of it and walking over the highway overpass to get to the other side. Okay. You can probably walk up the highway overpass in less than 2 minutes. Then you can cross over to the other side, probably in a total of 3 minutes or so. Now, if you imagine doing that repeatedly, all of a sudden the burden of climbing this large mountain goes away. Now, you might turn to me and be like, well, what are you talking about, Cyrus? This highway overpass is nothing. And the answer is you're right. But a mountain is nothing more than a series of ascents over a tiny highway overpass. So if you have the chutzpah to scale and cross over that overpass, then all you have to do is repeat that process over and over and over and over and over. And every time you do it, it's going to get just a little bit easier. It might get a little bit faster. It might get a little bit less burdensome. And it might just make your life a little bit more doable. Now, take in this idea of crossing over a highway overpass and doing it instead of 3 minutes in 2.5 minutes, and then from 2.5 minutes to 2 and 15 minutes, or 2 minutes and 15 seconds. Now, all you have to do is add in the X factor. And the X factor is called time. Okay. So time in this context refers to doing that same thing over and over and over again. And before you know it, the small hill here or there, which doesn't really take that much effort to cross, multiplied by 1,000 iterations is effectively the same effort as climbing a mountain over the course of time. Okay. It's just a mountain that's been chopped up into 1,000 small pieces. And each one of those pieces is something that you can tackle on a moment by moment basis. Hopefully this is making sense. Okay. Now we're humans, and humans just flat out don't like change. Humans resist change frequently, maybe too frequently. And it can become unnecessary, and it can actually get in the way of you making changes to your lifestyle and you making positive movements that are going to benefit your long-term health. So the key here is in finding your why. This is a process that can take a while, but it's totally worth it, and it's actually required for long-term success, because if you can define exactly what it is that motivates you to want to change your lifestyle, then you're more likely to stick with it in the long term, and you're more likely to mentally not think about crossing a mountain every single time you make a decision, but instead crossing over a highway overpass that seems very doable because you have a reason to do it. So simple questions that you can ask yourself when you're trying to define your why. People refer to this as the why that makes you cry, whatever you want to call it, right? The simple questions that you can ask yourself are, number one, why do you want to change your lifestyle in the first place? Okay. Why is this important to you? Is there something specific that you're trying to accomplish? You're trying to lower your LDL cholesterol level? You're trying to lose 25 pounds? You're trying to lower your A1C? Are you trying to be able to play with your kids a little bit more? Are you trying to go play a soccer game frequently and feel more human inside of your body? You're trying to return to a more active lifestyle? Okay. Write this stuff down, because it actually does matter. Next question I want you to ask yourself is, what is the best case scenario? AKA, if you were to change your lifestyle and you were to make some significant positive change, what do you hope can unfold from that process? You can fast forward a year into the future, maybe 2 years, maybe 5 years in the future, and picture your ideal self. Who are you in that best case scenario, and what has lifestyle change enabled you to do? At the same time, I want you to picture your worst case scenario and ask yourself a simple question. Say, if I don't change my lifestyle, well, then what's the worst case scenario that could happen to me? Who am I going to be a year from now, 2 years from now, 5 years from now? And, will I even be alive? Okay. Another question you can ask yourself is, what is the story that's inside your head that you don't tell anybody? What's the story that's happening 24 hours a day that's in the back of your mind that you might not want to verbalize to anybody because it might feel uncomfortable? Okay. Another question you can ask yourself is, how important is this to you? On a scale of 1 to 10, is changing your lifestyle a 1 or is it a 10? Is changing your lifestyle something that you can kind of, muster up a little bit of courage to do, and, you rank it on a scale of 1 to 10 as a 2? Or is it a 50 because you really want to do it and you understand that the power of doing it and you're just struggling to get started? Finally, another question you can ask yourself is, who are you doing this for? This is a very important question. Are you doing this for yourself, or are you doing this for someone else? Oftentimes we find that when people try to do this for someone else, it doesn't stick. But when you try and do it for yourself, it sticks. Why? Because humans are inherently selfish, but that's okay. In this context, being selfish is perfectly fine. So I want you to think about those questions that we just went over, and I want you to answer them. I want you to write them down on a piece of paper. I want you to take that piece of paper. I want you to stick it on your fridge so that you can look at it every single day. The next thing I want you to think about is that most people actually approach lifestyle change from a negative starting point. They say things like, my doctor told me to do this and I have to change my habits, or my wife told me that I'm getting fat, so I'm going to do this for her. Sometimes you'll hear things like, I'm sick of taking so many confusing medications. I just don't like it. Or my mom and dad both had heart disease and I'm trying to avoid the same fate. Okay. If you make any of those types of statements, then what you're doing is you're projecting it on to someone else, and you're approaching lifestyle change from a negative starting point, because these are all things that you're trying to run away from as opposed to things that you're trying to move towards. So rather than focusing on what are you trying to escape, I want you to think about what are you trying to move towards? What is going to bring you joy if you move in that direction? So you can change the conversation that's happening in your head from, I'm trying to escape this thing called diabetes, or I'm trying to escape this idea of using so many medications. And instead, you can now focus it on thinking about, you know what? I can't wait to lose weight, because if I do, then I'm going to get the opportunity to be as active as I was when I was back in college. Okay. Or you could say things like, I'm excited to become medication free for the first time in years because I've put in the hard work and I think I deserve it. Another thing you could say is, I can't wait to play basketball with my son and his friends. That would make me incredibly happy. Okay, so really think about these things. They might be small sort of mind games that you play with yourself, but the truth is that these things actually matter. Okay, if your inner monologue says something like, oh, this is boring. I don't want to do this. My doctor's making me do this. When can I stop? When is my cheat day? I don't like eating anymore, right? These are all negative associations that's going to make it very hard to sustain in the long term. Now, if your inner monologue says other things like, let's go for a run. This is fun. I'm tasting new flavors. My tongue seems like it's awake. Hey, you want to eat that new chickpea dish that you made for me last week? That was really tasty. I have so much more energy. I've never felt this good. Okay. My brain is working better for sure, and I can feel it. Okay. If you make those types of statements verbally to other people and then also inside of your own head, then guess what? You're setting yourself up with positive imagery, with positive associations, and then it's much more likely to work today and into the future. Okay. The truth is that when you change your lifestyle, you are likely to be happier, you are likely to be fitter, you are likely to have more energy, and you are likely to look better in your own skin. You're likely to impress the people around you by the way that you look and by the way that you interact with the world. You're likely to impress yourself with your newfound youth, and you're likely to have more energy than your kids and even your toddlers. And trust me, I have a 2-year-old girl and she has a lot of energy. So there's a lot of reasons to start to change your lifestyle. There's a lot of reasons to continue to eat a plant-based diet and to continue to modify your lifestyle for improved health. But let's have these conversations inside of your head. Let's write down your why, and let's make sure you really believe it. Because at the end of the day, you have to be the one to believe it. It's not about whether I believe it. It's about whether you believe it. And if you believe it, then guess what? It's gonna happen. Now, let's travel backwards in time. When I changed my lifestyle, I was 22 years old. I had a ton of habits already built into my lifestyle in the first 22 years of life. I loved eating me some meat. I loved drinking me some chocolate milk. I loved eating large meals, and I prided myself on how quickly I could eat those meals. I loved cheeseburgers more than any food on the planet. I loved eating 4x4s from In-N-Out Burger, which if you've never been there before, it's a West Coast-based fast food chain where they have a secret menu and you can order what's called a double, which is actually on their menu, which is 2 patties and 2 cheeses. Or you can order a 3x3, which is 3 patties and 3 cheeses, a 4x4, a 6x6, a 20x20, whatever you want. I used to have a contest with my friends. It was called the 4x4 in 4. And the trick was to try and order a 4x4, which is 4 patties and 4 cheeses, and eat that within 4 minutes. And the person who did it fastest won. Okay, these are the types of games that I used to play, and these are the types of foods that I really enjoyed eating. Okay, at the same time, I also had some positive habits. I loved playing soccer. I loved lifting weights. I loved staying active. I loved studying hard, and I loved to socialize. But in addition to that, I also loved smoking marijuana, and I loved drinking beer. So some of my habits were good. Some of my habits were not leading me in the right direction. But the truth is that a lot of these habits were ingrained in me, and they were things that I had acquired over the first 22 years of life. Okay. Now, changing these habits meant that I had to ask myself a series of tough questions. And the first thing that I had to decide was that if I was going to change my lifestyle, that I had to have an open mind and that I had to be willing to try. I had to be willing to get out of my own way, because if I was going to stand in my own way and I was going to constantly convince myself that making any type of positive change in my lifestyle was a dumb idea, or it wasn't going to work, or it seemed futile, then guess what? I was already making it almost impossible for myself to succeed. So by approaching lifestyle change with an open mind and saying to myself instead, you know what? I want to change. I want to improve my blood glucose control. I want to use less insulin. I want to feel less like an 80-year-old man and more like a 20-year-old man. Okay. I had to be willing to get out of my own way, and I had to be willing to make mistakes. I also had to be willing to talk about the changes that I was making with other people, whether they were my friends or whether they were my family members. And I had to be willing to be relentless in my efforts and not make excuses when I inadvertently put obstacles in my own way. A lot of the times people like to say, oh, well, life throws difficult things in your path. And the answer is, yeah, it does. But most of the time you put obstacles in your own way. And if you can recognize the obstacles that you are putting inside of your own way that are impeding your path to success, then that is a very evolved place to be. And if you can identify what you're doing to sabotage yourself, and you can either stop sabotaging yourself or identify the obstacles and start to remove them over the course of time, then that's going to enable you to move just a little bit further down the path towards a place of better health. Now, when I was making all these changes, I did recognize that as soon as the holidays would roll around, whether it was Thanksgiving or Christmas time or Easter or 4th of July or the Super Bowl, okay, and I would go home or I would get together with friends, what that equated to was that I would eat large quantities of food and I would pride myself on how much food I could eat because guess what? That was my ingrained habits. And that was just the culture that I grew up in. Okay. Now, these types of events, I used to look forward to them and I used to get frustrated by them simply because they were fun and they were social events. But at the same time, I knew that they weren't doing anything to improve my health. And so sometimes I would tell myself that other people were making my life hard because I was like, damn it, why are you going to hold a 4th of July party? Because if you do, you're making my life hard. But in reality, the host wasn't trying to make my life hard. The host was just trying to have a party. So I had to stop assigning the blame to other people and start taking responsibility for my own actions. And I had to start recognizing that there were things that I was doing and there was self-talk that I was engaged in that was actually making my life harder, and that I had to assume the responsibility for that because otherwise I was just going to constantly operate in a world where I was pushing my problems on other people. Okay. So if you were not raised to eat a plant-based diet, then guess what? Join millions of other people. Join me, join your neighbors, join your coworkers, join your ex-landlord. We're all in the same boat. Okay. The US culture is unfortunately not designed to reinforce the benefits of eating an evidence-based nutrition profile. It's not reinforcing what scientists have discovered. It's also not helping us become active in our daily movements and active in our lifestyle. And it seems like the entire environment that we are raised in can sometimes be constructed to make us fail in the first place. Okay. But here's the thing. I don't want you to have to beat yourself up. Okay. Just look at yourself in the mirror, just make a decision, and don't give up until you get the results that you want. I read a book back in the day by a gentleman named Dean Karnazes. At the time, he was the world ultramarathon champion. He had run more ultramarathons and had more championships in running ultramarathons than any human up to that point. And on one race, he ran over 200 miles by himself. And he was the first human to accomplish that. And when a reporter had asked him after a 48-hour journey how he ran 200 miles by himself with no support, he said, oh, it's actually kind of easy. I just put one foot in front of the other and I didn't stop until I hit the finish line. Okay, it's that kind of mentality that is very helpful when making a decision to make lifestyle change. Okay, don't let the culture that you're raised in become an excuse. Don't let your previous habits become an excuse. Get out of your own way and start making progress the way that you want to make it. Just make a decision and go. Time is of the essence, and the power is in your hands. It has always been in your hands, and it will always be in your hands. Just stop overthinking the process and just start. As Tom Cruise in the Top Gun Maverick film tells his star fighter pilot Rooster, he says, Rooster, don't think, just do. That's the mentality that I want you to have. Just stop thinking and start doing. Now, a lot of people focus on the things that they'll have to give up with their newfound plant-based lifestyle, rather than focusing on the things that they're going to gain in the process. Now, the feeling of giving up favorite foods can flat out suck, okay? Especially if it's food that you grew up on. Hamburgers are tasty. Cheeseburgers are even tastier. Pizza is tasty. So is cheese. Chicken pies used to be one of my favorite foods of all time, and so did fettuccine Alfredo. Not to mention banana splits with mint chocolate chip ice cream, chocolate sauce, and peanuts sprinkled on top. What about Eggo waffles? Let's not forget those. Okay, I grew up on all these foods, and I wanted to give up exactly 0 of them when I began eating a plant-based diet. But guess what? I didn't realize that even though I would temporarily give up these foods, that I was actually gaining the opportunity to eat a whole bunch of other foods that were not even in my consciousness. I didn't realize at the time that by switching over to a plant-based diet, I would gain the ability to eat as many mangoes as I wanted. And trust me, mangoes are one of my favorite foods of all time. And I know a lot of people who feel the same way. Okay. I also gained the ability to eat as many bananas as I wanted. I gained the ability to eat as many dates as I wanted. And guess what? My blood glucose was rock solid the entire time. No matter how many mangoes and dates and bananas and figs and peaches I ate, my blood glucose was rock solid. I gained the ability to eat foods like sweet potatoes and purple potatoes and corn, brown rice, chickpeas, black beans, pinto beans, peaches, oranges, large acai bowls, papayas, quinoa, kabocha squash, and the list goes on. At the time, I had no idea how much I would love these foods until I began eating them, and I began eating them frequently. And then when I began eating these foods, my desire to eat cheeseburgers and pizza and chicken pot pies, it just flew out the door. I wasn't even thinking about those foods anymore. Okay. In other words, I didn't know what I didn't know. I thought that if I started to eat different foods, that my desire to eat all these other tasty hamburgers and meat-filled dishes was going to overwhelm me, going to sabotage my ability to continue moving forward. But in a very short period of time, I began to realize that that was just a ridiculous story that I was telling myself. And the truth is that the new foods that I was eating tasted better than the old foods that I was eating. And I just, once again, had to get out of my own way. So if you're in this situation and you have this conversation happening in your own head, then I would encourage you to focus not on what you're going to lose, but focus on what you'll gain. And trust me when I say that you're going to gain a lot more than you lose. Not only are you going to gain the ability to eat specific foods, but you're also going to gain the ability to transform your lifestyle. You're going to start to think in a different way. You're going to have a new body. You're going to have new energy levels. You're going to have reduced biomarkers, reduced A1C, reduced fasting blood glucose, improved kidney function, improved liver function, a better functioning brain, and the list goes on. The truth is that you have absolutely no idea what you're about to gain. The possibilities are endless, and your adventure is unique to you. I cannot tell you what's going to happen to you, because if I did, I would be lying. You are the only participant who has to be willing and ready to engage on this adventure and go down the path and start to experience what lifestyle change actually feels like for you. And then you get to tell that story to everyone around you. Your adventure is absolutely unique to you. And I encourage you to get started, because it's going to be a fun ride and you're going to experience way more than you can possibly imagine today. You may have told yourself that you need blank for the hard times, or you need something to get through the hard times. It's easy to resort to alcohol, to drugs, and food for comfort when you're going through tough times. It feels good at the time, but it actually makes your life harder and more debilitating, because oftentimes it's because there's underlying challenges that are emotional that trigger the feeling of having to eat a particular type of food in order to make your emotions subside. Part of the reason that that happens is because developing coping mechanisms that don't involve alcohol, drugs, or food requires work. It's not easy to do, and it requires time and effort. This isn't a shame, okay? The guy who's producing this show behind the scenes dealt with food addiction for years before making a personal decision to eat a more plant-powered diet. His name is Colin. He's a very good friend of mine, and he has completely transformed his lifestyle from the inside out. And now that he's been eating a plant-based diet for the better part of a year, he actually has reported back to me that he finds it hard to view the world from his old lens. But the key was realizing that there had to be a change that he had to be willing to make, that he had to be willing to put effort into, and that he was no longer going to rely on the same mechanisms that he had grown up relying on, which were mainly food to help him cope with tough and negative emotions. Okay, if you rely on food, then we recommend it's time to work with a mental health professional so that you can understand exactly when it's appropriate to rely on food and when it's not. Personally, I'm not a mental health professional. However, there are plenty of very good mental health professionals that specialize in food addiction that can help you resolve a lot of these challenging emotions that drive you to eat a very specific way. Now, often talking with other people and sharing your experiences with your friends and family can make a massive world of difference. And even though it can be hard to talk about deep-seated feelings that drive your desire to eat food and eat more food and eat more food, talking about this verbally with a coach is something that can make a massive change in your lifestyle. So our solution to you is to work with a coach or work with a therapist who can help talk through the complexities of your complex relationship with food. The truth is that everybody has a complex relationship with food. Some of the complex relationships are positive, some of them can be negative, and some of them have a combination of both positive and negative. But simply talking this through with somebody that can listen to you and somebody that can lend you some insight can make a lot of positive change in your lifestyle. We know that this works. We've helped thousands of people through this process. And the question is, if you're willing to get started, then the world can become your plant-based oyster. Hi, I'm Cyrus Khambatta, co-founder of Mastering Diabetes and the New York Times best-selling author of Mastering Diabetes. Now, the science behind diabetes can get very complicated very quickly, but fortunately, your solution doesn't have to be. If you'd like to learn the simple, proven, and guaranteed method to take your life back from diabetes, you can go to masteringdiabetes.org/start to get guidance, coaching, and more information today. It's time to sit in the driver's seat of your diabetes health and make this the last coaching program you ever need. Are you ready? If you are, visit masteringdiabetes.org/start to get started in the same coaching program that's helped over 10,000 people around the world. See you inside. Now, there's another thing that can get in the way of the weight loss process, and that is the never-ending search for more dopamine. What does that actually mean? Well, it turns out that foods in today's grocery store are actually custom built to addict you to them so that you buy them again, and food manufacturers can make more money. These foods are referred to as hyper-processed foods, and these foods are actually dopamine-producing machines. They are manufactured and designed to specifically make you want more. You can think of them as covert nutritional CIA agents that operate undetected behind the scenes until it's too late. These hyper-processed foods literally hijack your brain and temporarily take over control of this complex supercomputer. And repeated frequent exposure to hyper-processed foods that can stimulate significant dopamine production leads to frequent hijackings, which leads you to feeling like you're out of control and have to get more hyper-processed foods in your diet in order to just survive and feel good throughout the day. The same thing happens with alcohol. Truth be told, alcohol is a highly addictive substance that can actually alter your dopamine producing ability. Sometimes it goes up and sometimes it goes down, depending on the type of alcohol you consume. And anytime you introduce an external dopamine producing agent into your diet, whether it's a liquid or whether it's a food, you run the risk of becoming a victim to food manufacturers and or the pharmaceutical industry. So what happens when someone is addicted to these types of dopamine producing agents? Well, they hit your taste buds. Taste buds send a neurological signal up to your brain that says, yes, this is very tasty. I want more. That elicits an endorphin release inside of your blood that elicits a dopamine release. And the dopamine, you can think of it as basically being a reward mechanism that says, whatever you're doing feels good. Please repeat that. So every time you're putting foods on your tongue that stimulate this overproduction of dopamine, you end up stimulating your brain with a flood of dopamine that is actually supraphysiological, meaning that it's released in larger quantities than is otherwise considered normal. The same dopamine production can happen when you eat whole foods like a banana or a mango or other foods that have a sweet flavor that give you pleasure. The difference is that when you eat hyperprocessed foods, the amount of dopamine that's produced is significantly larger than what you would elicit if you're eating a whole food. So dopamine itself is not necessarily a bad guy. It's the quantity of dopamine that is produced in your brain as a result of eating foods. So you have a choice. You can either eat foods that are whole in nature, that give you a small dopamine release that stimulate your brain to ask for more, or you can eat hyperprocessed foods from the grocery store that, quite honestly, sometimes taste way better and get a supraphysiological dopamine release inside of your brain that then stimulates you to really want to go get that food again. That, over the course of time, can turn into an addiction, and the addiction can end up leading you down a path that becomes dangerous because it does two things. Number one, it increases your risk for many metabolic diseases. And number two, it can cause you to intake excess calories, which then can stimulate the weight gain process. So how do you solve this problem? Well, there's a number of things that you can do at your disposal. Number one, you can reduce your intake of these foods, which sounds easy to do, but it's actually easier said than done. You can also cut out these foods cold turkey. And if you reduce your intake of hyperprocessed foods, you can still get a small dopamine production and you can wean yourself off over the course of time. If you go cold turkey, if you have that type of personality and you're capable of doing it, then chances are it's going to feel very uncomfortable for a small period of time. It could be a week, it could be 2 weeks, it could be 3 weeks. And then over the course of a small period of time, you end up feeling more normal because your brain has regained its normal dopamine production capacity and is no longer being hijacked on a daily basis. Now, we have a team of coaches that guide you through this process, and they're extremely talented at helping you get off of the dopamine trap. So if you want help, then by all means, book a discovery call to talk with a member of our team, and we'll see if you're a good fit for our personalized coaching program. We have thousands of success stories of people who have de-addicted themselves from things like cookies, crackers, chips, sodas, as well as, believe it or not, cheese. Cheese stimulates dopamine production, significant dopamine production. And that's something that Neil Barnard's book, The Cheese Trap, has exposed to the world. So if you're interested in learning more about this process, by all means, pick up that book. And again, we can help with this process. You just let us know. Now, another thing that can get in the way of the weight loss process is identifying yourself with a very specific image of who you think you are. Now, when you grow up a certain way, things can get baked into your identity deep down. You can start to believe that you are a specific type of person and that that person is molded in plastic and it's not going to change over the course of your lifetime. And then you can grow this perceived gap between who you are and who you want to be. So if you envision yourself as somebody who's different than who you actually are, and you recognize that there's an ability to get there and you can move towards that person, then you're in a good situation. But a lot of the times over the course of time, people end up solidifying this image of who I am and who I will always be. Okay. What's important is to build a belief inside of your own brain that change is possible. So when you use words like, I'm overweight, or I'm fat, right? I'm an athlete, right? These are just labels that we use to describe who we believe we are. And they represent a collection of choices that you've made up until that point. And they represent a specific identity that you have chosen to give to yourself. As we've talked about, who you are is a combination of your choices. It's a constellation of choices that you've made since the time that you were born. And it reflects your external physical state as well as your internal emotional state. So if you want to change into someone who is a more evolved species than who you currently are, which, by the way, should represent 99.9% of all humans, because evolving into a more evolved state of who you are is perfectly normal, then you can get there. A simple way to do that is to basically think about who you want to be 5 years from now. Okay, picture who is your ideal self 5 years from now. Okay. The next thing you can do is write down the most glowing recommendation of yourself. Okay. If you had to recommend yourself for a job, if you had to recommend yourself as a stellar human being to another person, write down exactly what that recommendation would say. Who are you? What do you represent? What do your words mean? How responsible are you? And more. Then, on a separate piece of paper, take the time to write a vile, hateful description of yourself, exposing all of your negative habits and all of the things about you that you wish you could get rid of. Okay. Once you have those two pieces of paper and those two descriptions of yourself, take a look at them and read them over 100 times each. Okay, really begin to understand who is the positive version of yourself, and then really begin to understand who is that negative version of yourself. Take that negative version and put it into a fireplace and burn it. Just get rid of it. As you read that description, you might feel feelings like shame and insecurity and feeling like you're not good enough and feeling like that person isn't someone that you want to identify with. By putting that into a fire and letting it go, you can literally detach from who that person is and detach from all of those feelings that you feel as a result of writing that down and identifying with that person. Okay. It may sound like a silly exercise, to be perfectly honest, because when I first learned about this, I thought, oh, what is that going to do? But it's extremely powerful. The reason is because those feelings that you have, those negative emotions, oftentimes thrive in silence behind the scenes. When you force yourself to write them down, you'll start to realize that a lot of them are just pure stories that are based off of fear. And when you burn them and when you make them disappear, you can actually exercise them from both your conscious and your subconscious mind. Again, I know it may sound silly, but the truth is that if you've never tried this process, it can actually be a very powerful way to detach yourself from the person you don't want to be and attach yourself to the person you absolutely want to be. So I recommend doing this process. I recommend really sinking into it. And when you do this, you might be able to detach from a feeling of who you are and actually start to attach to a person that is a significantly more evolved species than you, that represents all of the positive emotion and imagery that you choose to become. Now, there's one final thing that I want to highlight in the weight loss process, and that is yet another emotional state of being. And this is understanding that the words that you say actually have a very profound impact on how you think about yourself. The reason I'm saying this is because a lot of us like to talk about the things that we failed at over the course of time. Okay, whether it was, not passing a class when you were in college and having to retake it, or whether it was trying a workout at the gym that just didn't work for you and made you feel like you were not good enough, or whether it was trying to lose weight in the past and feeling like a failure and then regaining the weight and starting right back at square one. Okay. When you tell the same stories over and over and over again, and these stories evoke negative imagery of yourself, and you say those words out loud, well, guess what? If you keep telling yourself that you haven't succeeded in the past, then you're actually telling yourself that you're also not going to succeed in the future. Every time you tell a story about a failure in the past, you're welcome to talk about your failures openly. There's no harm in doing that. But I do want you to understand that it can actually work against you, because every time you do that and every time you tell the same story, you're further convincing yourself that you're not good enough. You're not smart enough. You're not fast enough. You're not strong enough. And as a result of that, you might begin to believe that story. So if you keep telling yourself that you're never going to succeed at things like losing weight or becoming stronger or reducing your cholesterol level or reducing your level of anxiety or becoming more financially independent, then guess what? The chances of you achieving any of those things become even harder. Okay. If you keep telling yourself that you're not worthy of living in your optimal state, then what you are doing is you're attaching yourself to an identity of failure because it feels comfortable, because it's something that you've already been through, because it evokes the imagery and the feelings that you've already lived. But here's the thing, it's probably not going to serve you. Okay. What we tend to do is exaggerate the impact of failing at something. So if you fail, that's okay. Failure is part of life, and failure is something you learn from and you move on from and you become better at over the course of time. But what we end up doing is when we tell these stories of failure, we like to exaggerate the details, and it becomes further and further and further ingrained into our subconscious mind that we are not worthy of success. Instead of doing that, think about it from a different perspective. Rather than focusing on the failures, why don't you celebrate your successes? Why don't you think of all the times when you actually have succeeded at something, whether it was small or whether it was large, and focus more on those rather than focusing on the failures. This is going to help you become a stronger person, and it's going to help you grow into a more evolved person. And any slip up or failure that you've had in the past, you can then spin it around and say, you know what, this is just an opportunity for me to discover what got in the way and how I can navigate this process so that it's no longer in my way. What I'm asking you to do is distance yourself from the failed image of yourself that you carry in the back of your head. Just literally stop talking about your failures temporarily. Just don't talk about your failures for the next 3 months. Stop identifying with an image of yourself that just flat out isn't successful. And I want you to start identifying with a new image that you are going to make for yourself. It's the same image that you wrote down on that piece of paper that describes exactly who you want to be 5 years from now. If this is hard for you to do, join the club. This stuff is not easy. But this is the stuff that gets in the way. Because if you identify with an image of yourself that is overweight, or an image of yourself that has a high blood glucose, or an image of yourself that is living with any combination of metabolic diseases, then guess what? That's going to persist. If you still need more help with it, you can work with a mental health professional and talk about your feelings and try and detach yourself from the old you and attach yourself to the new you. And by doing this, your coach can help you verbalize the person that you want to avoid and the person that you're trying to become. Okay? It's very important to do these things in your head and to do these things verbally every single day. Practice makes perfect. And the more frequently you can perform these exercises inside of your head and verbally with someone else, the more likely it is to become true. Okay? I'm asking you to be relentless in your evolution towards the person that you want to be. That person is absolutely inside of you. You just have to believe it. So we've touched on 7 things that can get in the way, that happen inside of your head and that happen externally when you're trying to evolve into a more healthful person or evolve into a more optimal state of being. But you know what? This is just scratching the surface. These are just a few things that we could think of that many of our clients experience and that many of our clients have reported back to us. Now, what we're trying to do is start a discussion in an open space where you can talk about the things that get in the way, the things that are in your head, the voice that keeps on holding you back, and the stories that you tell yourself over and over and over and over and over again. Because the more of a broken record you become inside of your own head, the more of a broken record you become to the outside world. Okay? You can treat all of these problems and all of these mental states as a universal challenge, and you can treat them because every single one of us does this to ourselves on a daily basis. And every single human being has faced challenges in their life at one point or another and faced failures in their life at one point or another. And that's perfectly normal. Okay. Now, maybe someone down the road had a chance to learn how to eat really healthfully since they were a 5-year-old kid. And you are feeling like you just never got that guidance and you didn't learn any of that information until you were 55 years old. Right? That's not a fault in your character. That's just life. That's just an opportunity for you to recognize that you have an opportunity to become a more evolved being. But you have to engage in this process and you have to become aware of what is actually happening in your head and the stories that you tell yourself, because these are the types of things that hold you back. Okay. I want you to open your mind to the idea of positive change. I want you to open your mouth to a plant-based diet that has a world of possibility that can significantly impact your metabolic health. I want you to put yourself into a constructive environment surrounded by people who can act as a very strong supportive network for you. I want you to put yourself in a constructive environment where making healthful food choices is very simple. And if you want to work with somebody who can help you evolve into the person that you want to be and stop identifying for the person that you once were, then you have all that opportunity with either a mental health professional or with a coach within the Mastering Diabetes program or the Mastering Weight Loss program. The power is in your hands. It always has been in your hands. And as long as you believe it, the world, my friends, is your proverbial oyster. Thank you so much. We'll see you in the next video.